was the king there, but he was not welcomed there by the people. And if you remember that, does anybody remember that story? David could detect that they weren't accepting him, and maybe he felt threatened by them. And do you remember how David behaved in that story?
Like he was crazy.
Right. He went around. It says that he had slobber coming down on his beard, and he was scratching on doors. And the king basically said, "I don't need this crazy person here." So, anyway, David apparently felt threatened enough that he had to put on a front to protect himself. But anyway, he wasn't welcome there in the city of Gath, and that's in 1 Samuel 21:10 through 15. Well, David then escapes to a cave, the cave of Adullam, and it was a large cave in the lowlands of Judah. And we're going to talk a lot about caves this morning. And I found this simple map, and the scale here is 0 to 10 miles. So there he was at Nob, and I would say, I don't know, maybe about, based on this scale, 20 miles over to Gath, and then here he comes down to Adullam. So as you can see, he's on the run. Now this gives you a perspective of where it is in relationship to cities that we're familiar with, such as Jerusalem and then the Dead Sea. So this was a map showing David's travels as he flees Saul. And I wanted to share with you this picture. Now we don't know that this is the actual cave David went into, but this is actually a cave at Adullam today, and this, would look something similar to what David probably would have gone into. Kind of gives you an idea of the landscape. How many have ever been over to that part of the world? I know my grandfather years ago went over there, and he really enjoyed it. I've never been. Maybe one day I can, but it's interesting to look at these photos and get an understanding of what it looked like and looks like even today. So this would have been what the cave would have looked like. Well, moving on, I told you to keep in mind Ahimelech, the priest, and that's where we get to now. Saul takes revenge against Ahimelech and the priest of Nob. Let's take a look at that. And this is in 1 Samuel 22, 6 through 23. Doeg, an Edomite, informed Saul, so he's basically telling on David. He informed Saul that Ahimelech had rendered aid to David. So he informs him that he's actually telling on Ahimelech, and he tells Saul that, guess what? He aided David. He gave him a sword. He gave him provisions. So immediately we see that this person, Doeg, is trying to find favor with Saul. Obviously, he doesn't care for David and hopes to see David dead. So he breaks the news to Saul that Ahimelech had rendered aid to him. Well, Saul called for Ahimelech and all the priests at Nob, and remember, that's where David had been. He called for Ahimelech, the one that gave David the provisions and Goliath's sword, and all the priests at Nob. Saul called them to him. Of course, they didn't know what was about to happen, and commanded his servants to kill them. Now, let's stop for a moment and look at this. Again, what does that tell you about Saul in this whole situation? What does it remind us of about Saul? What does it point out? It really jumped out at me, but what do you see here just by his actions? What do you, yes, paranoid. I see a lot of anger, rage. I mean, learning that a man, the king and the priest, and the king especially helping David, he wants to just kill them. So yes, there's paranoia, there's anger, jealousy, to the point that anybody who wanted to aid David or help David along, Saul wants them killed. Well, guess what? His servants refused to obey his command. They didn't want to do it. Now that tells me something about Saul's servants right there. You know, they knew who David was, and they knew the past of David, how he had killed Goliath, and how all the people loved him. So they're starting to, I think, turn the table here. They're not necessarily going along with Saul, and so they refuse to kill David. So this tells me a lot about them. You have Saul on one hand. Yes.
There's also the aspect of Ahimelech. What did I do wrong? David works for you. I was
Right,
leading him
right,
to
right,
his mission.
right,
So there was no way he would know that Saul was mad at David either.
right. He was probably shocked, and obviously afraid when he heard this was going to happen, but David's exactly right. All right. Well, Saul now instructs Doeg to kill Amalek and the priest, and you can probably suspect now that Doeg is probably going to go along with it, because he's the one that revealed to Saul what Amalek had done, so why would he not do it? Well, Doeg did obey Saul, and he killed 85 priests that day. Think about that for a moment. 85 people slaughtered right there just because of what they did for David, and then attacked Nob. Not only did he stop there, he attacked Nob and killed all its inhabitants. So Doeg, he's not a very honorable person here either. But he actually killed 85 priests that day and then killed all the inhabitants of Nob. Now, I would think he's trying to impress Saul, wouldn't you? However, Abiathar, now this was a son of Ahimelech, he escaped Doeg's attack and fled to David. So imagine him seeing this carnage, and he was able to get away, and so he runs and finds David and flees to him. All right, moving along. David is continuing, obviously, to run from Saul because he knows Saul is out to take his life. And he ends up saving a city. And this story here just amazes me to think about your own self. If you're running for your life, basically, as David was, what are you going to be focused on? You're going to be focused on protecting yourself, right? David's already hid in caves and he's on the run. So you would think that everything that you were doing would be that to save your life. Well, as David continues to flee from Saul and his men, and at this point, David's followers have grown. They've grown to about 600 men that are traveling with him. David and his men deliver the city of Kayla in southern Judah from attack by the Philistines. Again, when I look at each one of these accounts, I try to think about something interesting in it and something that just jumps out at me. And as I mentioned, what jumps out at me is the fact that David is not just thinking about himself. He has a man and hundreds of men after him to kill him, and yet he takes it upon himself with his men to deliver this city from an attack. So that again shows us a lot about David's character. He sees others in peril, and what does he do? Not only is he fleeing to save his own life, but he saves the lives of others. And that, to me, again, reiterates the point that David is an honorable person, that he is a man after God's own heart, that he cares about others. And I just think that's amazing that he took the time to do this as well. And I'm sure there were other reasons behind it, but that's what jumps out at me.
Did inquire of God if you should go or not.
Right.
And his men, he said, well, we don't want to go. And inquired of God again, and was able to convince him to go with him.
If you remember, many of his men at that time were discontented. They were in debt. But to think that David would still do this while fleeing Saul is amazing to me. It tells me a lot that he does want to do what God wants him to do, and he's still looking out for others. Any other comments on that? Well, moving along in the account, Saul heard that David was in Kayla, so he sent his army to attack the city of Kayla and trap David. It's described as besieging the city, to encircle it, to overwhelm it, to take it over, and in doing so, Saul was hoping to trap David there within the city. However, God being with David, he warned David, so he and his men fled to the wilderness of Ziph. It was here in the wilderness of Ziph that Jonathan came to David, and they renewed their covenant for the third time. We find this in 1 Samuel 23, 1 through 18. And I know you talked about Jonathan and David last week. What were the covenants between Jonathan and David, just as a refresher? Do you remember what they were, what they consisted of? We're now at the third time they make this covenant. What was that covenant that they made? Well, they had made a covenant, to be friends, be loyal to each other. And in this third covenant, Jonathan and David, basically, Jonathan tells David, I will remain loyal to you for life, no matter what happens. So it was there in the wilderness that David comes upon, talks to Jonathan again, and they make this third covenant with each other. I have another map here just to show you. We're now at Ziph, and there he's left Kayla and gone to Ziph, to give you an idea where it's located. And again, this scale is 10 miles, so that looks to be about, 12 miles, 13 mile distance according to this scale. But, that's quite a distance the way they traveled. But anyway, as you can see, David is on the run. And this map, the red line is David fleeing Saul, and the green line is Saul. So he's on the run from Saul here. It gives you an idea about where it's located in today's world, not far from the Dead Sea. And I found another photo that I thought was interesting. This is the I got this from I can't even read that. This is what the wilderness of Ziph looks like today. This is just a portion of it. So it's definitely a wilderness, isn't it? But there were several photos that I found, but I thought this one had the best depiction, but this is what it would look like today. So imagine David traveling through here.
Must have been more trees back then, because they call it a forest.
Right. I found some photos that show more trees, but as you can see, it looks like they've taken down quite a number of them.
There have been some studies done in several places in that part of the world where they would go into an old cave and find accumulated, rat droppings, basically. And they analyzed what they ate over the years. And during this time frame, the diet was entirely different than what it is today.
Really? Okay.
Because the climate has changed. Basically, a lot of people had goats and cattle, and they overgrazed the land and caused a climatic change to occur. There was, at one time, was much more
Mm-hmm.
So it was much more fun.
The grazing would answer a lot of it, I would think. Because even if you read during this time period, the number of sheep that were there were numerous. But anyway, over time, I agree with Monty, it's probably just overgrazing. But I did find some photos that showed more trees. But this was just one, to me, looks more like the wilderness, you may say. All right, well, David's in Ziph, but unfortunately, he encounters something else that's not in his favor. The Ziphites betray him. The Ziphites eventually betray David to Saul, so David and his men moved farther south into the wilderness. According to the text, they didn't move too far south, but they did move further south to get away from the Ziphites. And Saul continued to go after David, but gave up his pursuit after the learning that the Philistines were invading his territory. So Saul realizes, well, I've got another problem to deal with. I need to put this pursuit of David to the side for a moment, on the back burner. I need to go take care of what's going on over here. So he learned that the Philistines were invading part of his territory. So Saul and his men then battled against the Philistines. 1 Samuel 23, 19 through 29. So he puts his pursuit of David on hold for a moment. Doesn't mean, as we know, that he's stopping it, but he did decide to take care of these Philistines. Well, this is where we move into the gist of today's lesson, and we'll be coming to that in a moment. In 1 Samuel 24, David finds Saul in a cave. So David journeyed to En-gedi, located at the edge of the wilderness on the western shore of the Dead Sea. En-gedi was an oasis. What is an oasis? You remember what an oasis is? Right. Where water is, typically where you wouldn't expect to have much water, perhaps in a desert. It was an oasis watered by a hot spring that gushed forth hundreds of feet above the base of a large cliff. I had to go back and read this again to kind of imagine that. Gushing so high that it went up hundreds of feet above the base of a large cliff. So imagine you're looking up at this cliff and this hot spring is gushing up hundreds of feet above that. What came to mind when I read about this is hot springs. You know, when you read this, you think about Hot Springs, Arkansas. How many have been over there? You know, I've been there a few times. It's an interesting place, but nothing like this. But anyway, En-gedi was an oasis that had this huge hot spring. And the rocky gorges in the area, there were numerous rocky gorges, offered many hideouts at this particular place. So this is where we're next going to find David and Saul. Now, neither one of them at this point know each is there, but we'll see in a moment one does. So David finds Saul in a cave. When Saul returned from his encounters with the Philistines, he continued his pursuit of David with 3,000 men. And Saul entered one of the many caves in the area to rest, unaware that David and his men were in the innermost part of the same cave. The Bible mentions the word relieve himself. I read many accounts of this. I mean, he could have gone in there to take care of bodily functions, or he could have gone in there just to rest his feet. We're not really given the details. But Saul did enter this cave, and just so happens that David and his men were hidden in the very back of this cave. Have any of you ever been in caves? Do you like caves? I like to go in caves. One thing that I like about caves, and particularly on a day like today, is they typically stay cool, especially the deep caves. They tend to maintain a set temperature, if I believe, in the mid to upper 50s sometimes. So it's a good place to go in really hot weather. One of my favorite caves is Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, which is one of the largest cave systems in the world, if not the largest. And I just always remember, I don't care what time of the year you go in there, usually it's, I don't know, maybe a little off here, but usually it's around 56, 58 degrees in there continually throughout the year. So imagine David, if you've been in a cave, you can almost imagine what that was like. So David and his men are back here in this cave, and Saul enters it. And I found this photo. Actually, there were many photos that I found. I'm imagining that the cave they were in was probably larger than these that we see here, or the entrance might have been larger. I don't know, but there are still these caves over there today, and they're just numerous, all in the cliffs. So try to imagine David and Saul traveling along, and David and his men. And this cave had to be quite large, or very large, because David and his men were able to hide in the innermost part of it. So David and his men go in there, probably to get relief, to rest. It's a comfortable place, plus to hide, of course. David still needed to hide from Saul. And so Saul enters this particular cave, and David and his men are there in the back of it. Now we will look at 1 Samuel 24, which is the account of David finding Saul in a cave. Who would like to read 1 Samuel 24, 1 through 3? I have it here on the screen.
After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all of Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave.
Okay, thank you. So we see here Saul has returned from fighting those particular Philistines that had attacked part of his territory. And Saul learns, we're not really told by who, but he's told that David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. So Saul takes a rather large group of his men, soldiers, out of Israel and went to seek David. So they go to look for him. And as he goes along, he just so happens, as I mentioned, he goes into this particular cave, not knowing that David is in this cave. And how ironic is that, or what are the odds of that happening? Saul, going along and decide to go into a cave, and it happens to be the one David's in. But would you think that part of that might be God working? I would say so. I would think so. Because we're told there were numerous caves. So anyway, Saul happens to go into this cave where David and his men were hiding. All right. 4 through 5. Who would be willing to read that?
I will.
Okay.
The men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give you your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you." Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe, and afterward David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe.
All right. Thank you. We immediately see here, and understandably so, David's men reminding him that, the Lord had told you, I will deliver your enemy into your hands. And that tells me right away that they were hoping that David would go ahead and slay Saul here, because they knew if Saul were killed, then David would become king. And David would know that too, but what does he do? He stealthily, we know what the word stealth means. We have stealth bombers, and they can remain hidden from radar. Well, he stealthily went up to Saul. And think about that for a moment, how he must have done it really quietly to walk up behind Saul, literally close enough to cut off a corner of his robe. That would be really tough to do when you think about it, and think about the fear David may have had in him to do that, thinking that, I'm coming up upon a man who's pursuing me to kill me, and he has all these followers with him to kill me, and I'm this close to him, and I'm able to cut off a piece of his robe. Well, look what happens. David's heart struck him. That's a key phrase right there. David's heart struck him because he'd cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He hasn't killed Saul. He hasn't harmed him, but yet his heart is still struck, just the fact that he cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And we'll see why in a moment as we continue with this account, why he felt the way he did.
Seems it would have been easier for him to kill him when they cut the corner of the robe.
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. Because he had to sneak upon him quietly without Saul knowing. And Saul may have been tired and not been really paying attention, but still, Keith makes a good point. It would have been much easier for him to kill Saul than to just cut off that corner of his robe. That would have been much quicker and easier probably. But he decided not to. His heart struck him. Keep that in mind. All right, verses 5 through 7. And afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Again, we see in this account much about David's heart and his thoughts and his respect. His respect, first off, for God himself, because David knew that God had appointed Saul as king. And so if God appointed Saul his king, Saul was David's king. And David, even though he knew the hatred that Saul had for him, and knew that even though he knew Saul was pursuing him, he still had it in his heart to not harm Saul, because he still had that respect. He had that respect for what God wanted, God's appointment of Saul as king. And so that tells me a lot about David. Does anybody want to expound on that? Any?
Earlier on, when Goliath came to David and talked about Doeg killing off all the people of Nob, David was upset when he said, "I knew Doeg was there. I knew this was going to happen. I'm responsible for these people's death." So his heart went out to the people around him, not only to the people, but to Saul as well.
Thank you, Monty. It's really amazing to see how David behaves. You can see now why God had chosen him to be the next king, why he said this is a man after my own heart, because it comes out in all these accounts.
There's also, too, the fact that, okay, Saul's after David, but he's also Jonathan's father.
Mm-hmm.
He's well.
Mm-hmm.
And even though the primary thing I think is because this is the anointed of God, I'm not going to raise my hand against him.
Right. Dave makes a good point. You know, his love for Jonathan as well. Think about how that would hurt Jonathan, you know, for his closest, his best friend to kill his father. So that's a good point. Very good.
Too, about what you were saying a minute ago about the heart of David that you can see here, and you contrast that with the heart of Saul,
Mm-hmm.
and look back at how he killed all the priests of God in a couple of chapters earlier in Nob. So he had no respect for God's anointed priests, but here David has ultimate respect for God's anointed king, even though he's not the best guy around.
Steve's exactly right. I was, when preparing this lesson, I'm glad you brought that back up because I'd kind of forgotten. There is a tremendous contrast here. You can see it right away. You see David, as Steve said, the heart he had that wants to follow God, that does follow God. And then you've got Saul, who really cares nothing about those around him, only about himself, and protecting what belongs to him rather than what God would want. So, yeah.
I think that's the key thing because, I mean, what it says in the passage there that, you know, David knew that Saul was God's anointed one, knowing what God's will was. He had there for reasons. Like today, you know, leaders are there for a reason, and God's will with that. Saul always had his own interest in mind, and certainly the means would have justified the ends if he had taken Saul's life at that time. That wasn't probably, I'm thinking, maybe his mind, it still wasn't in the Lord's will for him. And so he was really seeking for, even in that moment, what God's will probably was instead of his own interest at that time. So
I would like to carry that further. That's an excellent point. It's a lesson there for us. Aren't we told that God sets up leaders and he also takes down leaders? And it's difficult in our age today, even as it was then, to always accept who's in control, in command, you might say, in a leadership position over nations. That's difficult for us as humans with the climate and the culture that we live in. But this story reminds us that we have to step back sometimes and realize that, you know, God has a plan. God had a plan here, and Jamie makes an excellent point. And that's difficult to do. It's difficult for me many times, but sometimes I do have to step back and think, you know, God is in control. He establishes kingdoms and leaders, but we don't have the wisdom of God, obviously, and so there may be a plan there that we're not aware of, obviously that we're not aware of. And this is the same case here. Thank you, Jamie. And Steve, for your bringing out those 2 points about the contrast between David and Saul. All right, moving on, verses 8 through 10. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, "My Lord, the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. And David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed." Again, this just compounds the fact of about David's respect for Saul, and Saul being God's anointed. To imagine him running out and calling out, "My Lord, the king," saying this to the man who's seeking to kill him, and falls to the earth. You know, he literally falls and bows his head down before Saul, showing great respect. Now, can you imagine doing that to someone that you know has such hatred for you to the point that they're going to kill you? This is amazing, isn't it? But again, it shows us David's heart and David's loyalty to God and God's plan. So he runs out, and basically this is when Saul learns that David was there. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. Imagine him standing there holding that piece. And you imagine the bewilderment, the look on Saul's face. Not only David is there, but David is holding a piece of Saul's robe in his hand, which shows Saul he was right upon me. He could have slayed me right then and there. That's how close he was to me. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and I did not kill you. Remember, Keith said it would have been easier for him to kill Saul. But I didn't kill you. You may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. Powerful words. Could have killed you, Saul, and you're hunting to kill me, but I didn't take your life. I could have protected my own life by taking yours. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancient says, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. Notice what David does there when he says, may the Lord judge between me and you. What he says, may the Lord avenge me against you. What is he doing there? He's putting it in God's hands, right? He's saying, Saul, I could have taken your life. I could have taken your life to protect my own, but I'm not going to do it. I have the opportunity to do so, but I'm going to let the Lord avenge me. Verse 14 through 15. After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do ye pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. As soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, is this your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, and that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me therefore by the Lord that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David swore to this to Saul. And then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. We see quite a change in Saul here, don't we? It's amazing. But now he finally recognizes that David is going to be king, and that he will establish the kingdom as the kingdom of Israel as God had intended. And this leads me to what we just saw a moment ago in a previous verse. What's the application for us today? Well, there are many applications, but the verse out of the New Testament that came to mind was Romans 12, 17 through 21. Application for us as Christians today. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. I thought this verse that Paul wrote through inspiration of the Holy Spirit is very applicable to what we've just studied, in the fact that we don't need to take vengeance upon those that are against us, just as David did not. Repay no one evil for evil, but let God take care of it. So a lot of lessons in this story this morning, a lot of good lessons for us. And it really gets down to us examining our own hearts and check to make sure our hearts are like that of David that he had when he approached Saul. Saul was an enemy of David at this particular time. He was out to kill him, but yet David did not bring harm upon Saul. He had respect for him, on the contrary. And that's how we should live our lives. It's so easy to carry around thoughts of against those who are against us, and remember what Christ told us. Whatever's in our hearts, that's really what we're thinking. It's as if we had already done it. So we need to really watch our own lives and make sure we're not seeking vengeance when we should allow God to do so, just as David did. Any final comments, questions, or additions that you'd like to make?
Sometimes we get ourselves all worked up over something. Basically, we're leaving God out of the process when we do this. And Saul had done this. He got himself all worked up, full of worry and fear and hatred and whatnot. And then he had a brief reprieve where God was brought back into his mind and he saw that he had been doing wrong. Unfortunately, that he went back to
Yes.
away from thinking about God again.
Right, and we'll see that in the
We can do the same thing. We can get all worried and upset about things, but we need to remember God's in charge of things, and we need to think about that. Don't get all worked up over things
Right.
that trouble our hearts sometimes.
Good point, Monty. This is where the Old Testament has such beautiful and rich accounts that help us even today. And the New Testament backs it up, you know. Thank you. I appreciate your comments and your attendance this morning, and I hope you have a good rest of the day and a good time coming up in worship. Thank you.